more information about the Q&A that's about to happen. But with that being said, hello everyone, and welcome for joining today. My name is Mahoney, and I'm the Director of Scientific Affairs and Training Programs at BioCanRx, Canada's Immunotherapy Network. I'd like to start by thanking you, the participants, and also the speakers for attending today's moderated session with Bill Haney, the filmmaker of Jim Allison Breakthrough. So we're going to get started with a watching of the trailer. So I'll start this now, and just cue me if you can't hear the sound, but we should be good to go on that front. Good.
No, Megan, I can't hear it.
Okay, thanks, Stephanie. Let me just try that again here.
Part of Jim's success is the fact that he's an iconoclast. Great scientists are creative people.
Jim's lab has a feel of being like a pirate ship.
Jim theorized that tumors have evolved to trick the immune system.
At the time, it was a crazy idea.
This constituted a real breakthrough.
I knew that this is a way to cure cancer, and I'll be damned if I'm gonna let that just lay around.
For the next decade, he had one goal: to get that made into a drug for cancer patients.
It was just no, place after place after place.
Many of my colleagues said, this will never work.
My mother sat on the bed and went through and held her hand while she died. I found out later that it was lymphoma. When I was first told I had prostate cancer, I was terrified because it was a week after my brother had died.
BMS was not sure they were going to take it at all.
I must admit I was apprehensive.
His experiment in this was to just keep fighting, to say, there's something here.
He's willing to do it in the face of his colleagues not necessarily believing him.
He wanted to stay on the scientists, he wanted to stay on the FDA, he wanted to stay on Bristol Myers Squibb.
I need to get it into people. I need to get it into patients.
I got a phone call from the radiologist. And he goes, what did she get? All the cancer went away.
Until then, it was just a concept. She was the first patient I'd ever met.
How in the world are you supposed to adequately thank somebody that without them, you wouldn't be here?
That makes it all worthwhile.
It takes a really powerful idea combined with someone willing to push it forward to make it happen.
The number one thing I learned was how important it is just to persevere.
We knew we were changing the world.
May I ask you to step forward to receive the Nobel Prize?
Great. So as you just saw, Jim Allison Breakthrough tells a really fascinating story about a renegade, a pioneering scientist, Jim Allison, who led and inspired a dream team and many dream teams over his tenure to develop a breakthrough cure for cancer, one of the world's deadliest diseases. So today, Jim Allison is, he's a name within our field. He's a name within many different fields, and he's absolutely a force to be reckoned with in the scientific world. As many of you likely know, he won the Nobel Prize for Medicine in 2018 for discovering the immune system's role in defeating cancer, and particularly the discovery of the role of CTLA-4 in cancer and the eventual clinical development of ipilimumab. So for decades, and I think that was really poignant in the film, he waged a very lonely war, lots of skepticism of the medical, from the medical establishment, and a lot of resistance to his scientific view and his theory and research. So this astounding true story is just really warm-hearted. It's about a very stubborn man's visionary quest and a victory in terms of his quest to cure cancer. So with that being said, we're really pleased to host this, especially in Cancer Immunotherapy Month. And I'll start by introducing Bill Haney, the filmmaker. So Bill, welcome. And I'll just, start with an introduction. So you are a filmmaker, you're an inventor, you're an entrepreneur. I think it's fair to say you wear many, many different hats, and it sounds like many at the same time. He's a co-founder and CEO of Dragonfly Therapeutics, a Boston-based biotech company developing NK cell-based therapies to cure cancer, who has major partnerships with BMS, Merck, and AbbVie. As a writer, director, and producer of both narrative and documentary films, he's won the Gabriel Prize, a Silver Hugo, a IDA's Perry Lawrence Prize, award, and the AAAS Kavli Science Journalism Gold Prize for in-depth reporting. Additionally, he has awards that include Marine Conservation Award, a Genesis Award, and awards from Amnesty International and Earthwatch. Bill's portfolio as a filmmaker includes award-winning documentaries on socially important subjects such as coal mining and, for instance, The Last Mountain 2011, A Worker Exploitation, The Price of Sugar 2007, and we can gladly put this in the chat as well. And he's a worker and producer on Tim Disney's civil rights drama, American Violet. So I think that's a short description. I know you've got a really great perspective and history, so we really welcome you here today. And I'd also like to introduce Stéphanie Michaud, who is the president and CEO of BioCanRx, and Douglas Chung, who is a PhD student in the lab of Dr. Pamela Ohashi at the Princess Margaret Cancer Center or Hospital, and is also a member of our HQP working group. So at this point, I'll pass it over to the three of you, and I really look forward to the discussion. So thank you for being here.
Thank you so much, Bill, for joining us. And I first of all, I'd like to start off by saying thank you for making this film. Outstanding. The perspective that you have brought to this, you know, the story of Dr. Allison and the team, right? The team, the family team, the graduate student team, the colleague team, the business team that made all of this a reality. The story was incredibly compelling. So my first question for you, because you had insight by interviewing so many different individuals that had a unique perspective on Jim Allison, what surprised you the most about him?
You know, first of all, thank you for BioCanRx, and thank you for those nice comments, Megan, and I appreciate being with you. It's a privilege for me. You know, I guess I think that it's not a surprise, but it's a constant reminder that the quest in science is as rich in emotions and personal turbulence and personal drama as the quest to be, to work on peace issues in Rwanda or aging issues in Boston. You kind of imagine at some level that the work of science will take place in a slightly more emotionally composed and predictable structure, but it's of course just the creative life in all the same ways that you would expect the life of a poet or a playwright, full of roller coaster like ups and downs and consequences. And I think if somebody asked me when I began, I probably would have expected it, but then I was constantly surprised by, the kind of emotional turbulence that went with the journey for Jim and for many of his colleagues.
Absolutely. And you certainly captured that. Thanks.
Pleasure.
So I also had a question, and again, thank you, Bill Haney, for being here. And it's an honor to really meet you. So you kind of, throughout the story, it seems very linear. It seems, well, I don't know if linear is the term, but there's one thing happened and another. And I was just wondering how you got into that process of interviewing or choosing different interviewees, and whether or not your uncovering of the story was as linear and logical as we kind of saw it happen. Like, did you start with Dr. Jim Allison, and then he was like, okay, talk to this person, talk to my grad student who made the CTLA4 paper. So it seems, and also you had Jed Warhawk, Padim Sharma, Louis Lanier. As a grad student, these are the stars, right? The really people we look up to. So how did you pick and choose who to interview, and how did the story unfold?
Well, first of all, thank you. And second of all, I share your respect for some of the characters in the film, many of whom have become friends of mine. And they're really an extraordinary group, in part because of their personal warmth and compassion, as much as for their scientific acumen and kind of clinical focus. And I think that's a really good part of the story. I don't know all the folks who are on this call, but in some ways I was targeting this film not at you or your colleagues, but at a 12-year-old girl, who wants to live a purposeful, imaginative life and might not be aware that you can do that in the sciences. And I say girl because the statistics are that boys who are interested in the sciences at 12 years old are much more likely to become a scientist later, and girls are not. And there's lots of reasons for that. But so part of what I think I like about Pam Sharma or Rachel Humphreys or Jed Wolchuk or Louis Lanier is that they represent all the varied paths that you can take to a life in the sciences, and in this case, to kind of clinical creativity in the clinic. The storytelling, I'm glad that you felt it well structured. There was a certain amount of more chaos in the beginning. I'll give you for instance, and I know many of the folks on the call haven't seen the film, but that it starts pretty early in with Jim winning the Nobel Prize. But I kind of gambled on all of that. So the last day of filming, Jim and I were together in Manhattan. We filmed till like 9 o'clock at night, and at 3 o'clock in the morning, he won the Nobel Prize the next day. And lots of things that happened by serendipity through all of this. And, there's a certain amount of planning to be ready in case serendipity takes place. But so the structure of the film had that in it. And structure wise, it's a complicated film because you've got essentially 3 stories going forward, in forward time and 1 story in backward time. Because the story, at least for me, the story of the patient, Sharon, and her courage and the transformation in her life and her family, the consequences for her family of this game-changing drug are what give the story a lot of its emotional richness. And then the story about the science itself, while doubtless easy for you to follow, as I say, pitched to people who are not scientists themselves and who are perhaps early in their lives and thinking about the sciences, or often the children of scientists or children of physicians. Because one of the things that's been kind of a surprise is, we're now into millions and millions and millions of viewers, and the letters that I get are really often, it's been hard to explain to my kids what I do, but when I showed them the film, they understood why I work so hard. And they understood what the sense of purpose that motivates me is in a way that helped me, the mother who's, often at work. And so finding a way to kind of tell the science in a way that was approachable, and then Jim's story, and then the story of the team and the story of the drug, and then the backward story of Sharon. I'm grateful that you found it well structured and straightforward, because it took me a little while to puzzle through.
So like as a graduate student going to these conferences, you also hear kind of bits and pieces here and there, but seeing the complexities or even the fun parts, like him blowing up a lab, like I would never had imagined that's what he would have done, right? Or just like I think the patient component, like what you said, really grounded everything. And I think that's one of the key points where it anchors people, because not everyone, but a lot of people have family members or themselves kind of suffer through cancer. And so seeing the hope and that component to it, I think was really, really powerful. And
part of the story of, great talent is that if we're not careful, it can feel distant. And the more approachable and a human scale it feels, the more it's within the reach of, your colleagues, the folks on this call. And, I made a movie in Cuba a long time ago, and it included a variety of things, but I ended up with Hemingway's papers in Hemingway's house in Havana, and the first draft of Old Man in the Sea. And for which, most of you know, his Nobel Prize in Literature kind of kicked off as a result of Old Man in the Sea. And, it's a novella, so it's relatively short. On every page, every word was crossed off and changed. There was nothing that hadn't been changed. It had been worked and reworked and reworked and reworked. And you see with Jim, it's certainly true he had an imaginative spark, but you could make a case that his determination and perspicacity and emotionally sophisticated ability at building a team and collaborating were more important to the accomplishment than keen scientific insight. And those things are all learnable and approachable and reasonable for all of us.
Just to follow up on that with respect to, the building the team, and to pick up on something that Doug said, and to your comment about receiving letters from folks that are in the medical field or in science saying thank you. You've really explained, or you've really captured that feeling of what it feels like to work in a lab. And so, question for you: Did you go out to actually create, and it's just come to me right now, a recruitment movie for science? Because that's really what you've done in a way. You've captured the collaboration, the teamwork, demonstrating that with his great leadership. His whole lab moved from San Francisco to New York because they believed the work, they believed in the team, they believed in that cohesion. And you've reminded me of the incredible cohesion that comes from working on a scientific project, working in the context of a team, right? When we're carrying out research.
I think that, well, I'm glad you feel that way. And the short answer is yes. And so, and I also wanted to talk about the creative journey of scientists. In the United States, in our Constitution, there's only one right granted to Americans. It's not freedom of speech or freedom of religion or freedom of assembly. Those come later in the Bill of Rights. The only right granted to Americans is the right to the creative output, to the ownership of their creative work, copyrights and patents. And I kind of think of those as sister muses. But if I asked you, to walk down the street today and just stop the first person you ask and say, name me 5 creative Canadians, or name me 5 creative figures in the world, or name me 10. They will name poets and singers and playwrights and actors, musicians. They will not name scientists, but they should. And then the collaboration, of course, you're right. The collaboration is a source of joy and community. And we all know that science is a community, and that a lot of what we find sustaining is kind of a selfless commitment to the community. Because if you publish crappy work, you're going to damage the whole community long term. And if you publish great work, even if it's something that you discovered that you thought would be effective and wasn't, you're enriching the community beyond yourself. And that kind of selflessness, I think, is the centerpiece of science. And then, of course, there's the language, sadly controversial in the Western world today, that facts matter, that a collaboration of the best and brightest minds focused in a thoughtful way on a common subject from whatever their ethnicity and personal background, religious preference, sexual orientation, is something to be celebrated. These things were challenging under the Trump administration, but challenging in Hungary, challenging in Poland, challenging in all over, sadly, all over the world. And so the notion of a team of varied skills and backgrounds who have common purpose around something that's bigger than themselves. When Aristotle wrote about what it was to be a hero, he didn't write because you could smash big things. It was somebody who takes bigger and bigger risks for something more important than themselves. Scientists very often do this. Clinicians very often do this. And in our story, even the patient, because we all know the sign on to a phase 1 clinical trial, the patient's in extremis, the circumstances are challenging, the likelihood of success is small, and that they too are courageous for things beyond themselves. And so yes, I'm interested in celebrating the culture, the characteristics of the culture, the scientists, their ability to collaborate. And then the final thing I would say to you is, this is my 17th movie. And, you referred to several of them, civil rights and human rights films, and they tend to be, as an example, I lived with the poorest people in the hemisphere, who are Haitians, worked to death in the sugarcane plantations of the Dominican Republic. And I spent 3 years with them. There was a priest who was an acolyte of Mother Teresa trying to fight for their human rights. There were plantation owners who were exploiting them. The average life expectancy was 40 years old. The maternal and infant mortality was repellently high. They had the highest AIDS rate, tuberculosis rate, cholera rate in the Western Hemisphere. You can probably guess who the good guy and the bad guy is in a movie like that. But, in our more polarized and increasingly polarized world, I was looking for a sense that where we could all be on the same side. And, one thing you can say about the varied, beautiful, and sometimes painful differences between us, there are very few folks who are pro-cancer. And so, rich, poor, north, south, black, white, doesn't matter. No one is in favor of it. And by having, in this sense, a common enemy, and an enemy that for thousands of years, it's on it's on, wall paintings in Egyptian tombs trying to figure out ways to cure cancer. It's an enemy that has bedeviled us for a long time. And one of the rules of storytelling, or guidelines of storytelling, is the hero can only be as interesting as the villain is effective. And, if cancer is the villain and it's been painfully effective at causing pain to humans for thousands of years, then overcoming it requires something unusual. And the answer, of course, is a team drawn by common values, with common purpose, trained in these in the ways that you and perhaps many of the folks on this line have been trained, with the compassion that many of you have, and I'm sure all of you have. That set of values and sense of purpose and training and skills are a team that, in this case, could beat back cancer and launch the immuno-oncology revolution, and is a reminder that science as a muse and a guidepost, and teams, if they could cure cancer, then maybe they can do something about climate change. Maybe they can do something about income inequality, or migration challenges, or water rights, or endangered species issues, or other issues that often seem to be well beyond us. But then again, for most of my childhood, the idea of curing cancer was a throwaway joke line. You're late to dinner. What, were you out curing cancer? But of course, now we see that you can. And I think that's also a reminder of what a team of gifted scientists can do.
Thank you.
So I guess I wanted to challenge you a little bit with this kind of concept of using cancer as a glue to kind of hold everyone together. And I think with a lot of health and kind of seeing firsthand in research how there's so much international collaborations, I do really believe that it is these common enemies that we can have these international gatherers come together. So I wanted to ask how you kind of saw maybe the negative sides or the challenges that we have for those collaborations. So for example, during COVID, there's been a lot of different disparities where certain countries or even within a certain country, there are the wealthy versus the poor, and there's marginalized communities that are not getting access to healthcare and vaccinations. And so similar with cancer immunotherapy, we know these immune checkpoint inhibitors or adoptive cell therapy, they're so expensive right now, and really are only applied to certain individuals that can be attending clinical trials. So how do you see this kind of world of healthcare equality, or this global collaboration without the horrors of the politics that are driving it down? Like, can you just kind of explain all of that?
There's a lot in that, Douglas. I don't know that I can explain all of it, but I feel what you feel, and I understand where you're coming from, and I respect it. So it's true that because we have a good example for how teams can do extraordinary work, it doesn't mean that we've overcome the limitations of human nature. And ego, the lust for power, greed, sloth. These are challenges. And, I mentioned Aristotle a moment ago, and Aristotle, of course, wrote about democracy too. And he wrote that the perfect size democracy was 50,000 people. Well, we're not 50,000 people in Canada or the United States or any of the Western world or any of the Eastern worlds. And so I don't think that science offers a solution to the, beautiful craziness of being human. I think it just offers tools with which we can kind of manage it in a constructive direction. And in terms of collaborations, whether they're between individuals or between labs or clinics or hospitals, whether they're within government systems, or within a company, if you're not united by a purpose bigger than yourself, then you're squabbling over your own self-interest, whether that self-interest is the right to publish or stock options or government hierarchy or which campaign, whether you're going to win the next campaign. And we watch before us politicians who seek to divide us so they can gain power, executives who, seek to manage things for their own enrichment as sometimes a sole objective, and the social discord that comes from that. So, we see it when we're thinking, you're bringing up both the beautiful and the painful. I was asked to make a movie yesterday about the Wuhan lab leak, or the Wuhan lab leak question. I don't know what happened. So let's start by saying, I don't know what happened. And what we do know is that there's been beautiful things that happened. There were Chinese scientists who published the sequence of COVID when they were told not to. And thank God they did. And there were Turkish immigrants to Germany who used those sequences to build the Pfizer drug in a really exciting way. Great. Were there government officials in the United States who used that information properly? No. Some yes, some no. In China, some yes, some no. Are there companies that pursued old-fashioned ideas? I have relationships with Merck. I think they would say they pursued a traditional antiviral approach. Why was that? Obviously they've been fantastically successful. They've done beautiful work for people in lots and lots of ways. They got into a pattern. They needed something to disrupt that. mRNA vaccines clearly have shown us a new path. I think that in COVID, we see all the beauty, confusion, and pain of human nature. And I think that we can see it in, immuno-oncology today. And for those of you who are clinicians, I spent this weekend at the funeral of a dear friend, and, he got offered a choice. Try this novel immuno-oncology drug, but you can't have any chemo before you do it, or try the chemo that's going to give you some time, but not that much. These are terrible decisions for people to make, and we're understandably emotional about them. It's whether we're, in these extreme cases or other places. So I'm mostly forgiving and understanding about human nature, and, politics and institutions tend to be human nature amplified. It's a good reminder of what leadership can be. Leadership should guide us beyond those things to issues that are beyond our individual self-interest, or the moments that are before us, and into something longer term. And Jim's willingness to do that, Bristol Myers willing to do that, didn't mean that Pfizer wasn't trying to beat them. They were. And that competition might have been good for patients. It just meant that they ultimately, and for all we know, Rachel Humphrey was motivated because she wanted to be able to tell people she did this and get a bonus. Okay, well, she did it. She took the risks. That's okay with me. But I'm a little more grizzled than you are, Douglas. So maybe I've had to accept a little bit more.
So you, as Megan was, of course, I've gone through your bio, and hearing Megan again go through your bio, you have this exceptional background, and so the filmmaking. And I've just heard you now say you've made 17 films. How did you get into filmmaking?
I've never taken a class in filmmaking. I got into filmmaking, in kind of two steps. The first answer is my mother made me. I'm an Irish Catholic boy from the smallest state in America, from Rhode Island. And I was running a tech company, and, maybe 25 or something like that. And I got a phone call from my mother, who is a force to be reckoned with, even now at 83. And she said, Billy, I've got a favor to ask. And I said, sure, what is it? She said, promise you'll do it. And I said, but what is it? And she said she had been to visit, we grew up on a tiny little island in Rhode Island. She'd been to visit her neighbor and her best friend from when she was young. And the woman was very old, and her husband was dying of cancer. My mother went to visit, see George, and she walked out with Mary. And it was an emotional day, and she asked Mary, what could she do to help? And Mary said, the only thing George wants to happen before he dies is he was filmed in a documentary 4 years ago, and then he never heard from the filmmaker or anybody since. And George is hoping to see that film before he passes. So my mother said, so I'd like you to get that fixed. And I said, do you know the name of the film? She said, no. I said, do you know the name of the filmmaker? And she said, no, but you'll figure it out. And she hung up. And, a few weeks later, I found the filmmaker who had given up filmmaking and become a private detective in Florida. And we had a very bizarre phone call where I said, look, I don't mean to be imposing, and I don't know anything about filmmaking, but here's what I'm trying to have happen. Tell me, were you the filmmaker for this? And he said, yes. And I said, how can I help? And We had an extended discussion, and I had no creative role at all. I just helped him get himself up and going. And he finished the film, which is a beautiful film called Fast, Cheap, and Out of Control. Got back into filmmaking, would go on and win an Oscar and for another movie called The Flag of War. And I put filmmaking down and didn't do anything else. And then I was camping in Baja Sud, so in the Mexican side in San Ignacio Lagoon, in a World Heritage site in the last undisturbed gray whale nursing lagoon. Mitsubishi Chemical, this is now 3 years later, was planning to build the world's biggest industrial factory inside this nursing lagoon. And we went to try to stop them. And, after 3 days of camping and trying to figure out stories and, coming up with various strategies, somebody said, somebody here has to make a movie. And frankly, we had all been drinking whiskey and I was the slowest to say, not me. And so it was determined that I would be the person, and there I go. And so I wandered into it. But it is a way for common discussion. And it's a way to open our reflections because it uses so many of the arts, but in this case, importantly, music. And while we may not notice it, and we talk about the images and we pay attention to the images, our active mind, our reptilian brainstem is affected by the music. And we absorb things much more long-term when we're emotionally connected to them, and the music is important to that. So I've discovered that films are really interesting ways to allow an open discussion about complex ideas, particularly with people who are not practitioners of them. And I like them.
Thank you. And to great effect, I might add. Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And we kind of see that too with the Breakthrough documentary, how music kind of keeps coming back and back, and just seeing, like, if I was Jim's student, just seeing my supervisor out there playing harmonica. I mean that's crazy. But so how did music really play a role in Jim's life as well, or look, why did you kind of use that as a mechanism to string everything along?
Well, I think music, sound generally, music specifically, undergirds all filmmaking. If you asked me, the number one thing I've learned in making the various films I've made is that if you're not careful, people talk all about the picture and it's actually all about the sound. And it's astonishing how we connect viscerally to even sound effects. Now, in the case of Jim, and so, I wanted to kind of build a common cultural connection. So Jim had an interest in a love affair with Willie Nelson's music. We hired one of Willie Nelson's musicians to help write a score for the movie, because that would get the kind of ethos of Willie and the instrumentation to kind of undergird the storytelling. But Jim's particular, interest in playing music, of course, is relevant to the story too, as you're pointing out. And in that sense, I think two things. First, I think, and you know this, that the mathematical, scientific mind and the musical mind are very well connected and complementary and sympathetic with one another. And for many gifted scientists or musicians, and in this case for Jim, and they allow him to kind of connect to his more intuitive side. And I think that that's something we're trying to kind of communicate, if subliminally, in the film. It's also true that Jim has a traumatic childhood. It's not only does he, his last and only real memory of his mother is her dying while he holds her hand, dying of cancer. And his father, as we imply in the film, essentially becomes a drunk and goes walkabout and never comes back. So he is essentially abandoned in these early years, and looking for some sort of structure. And he's in creationist Friday Night Lights, South Texas. And for those of you who aren't, from the United States or deeply knowledgeable of Texas, I mean, it's a very, unique kind of frontier brand of culture. And then this is not outside the city. So this is, even more frontier because it's the country and it's on the Mexican border. So it is not a place that, as a general idea, is celebrating revolutionary ideas. And I think Jim is looking to find something to hold on to. And he his religion becomes science and music, and he holds tight, and they bring him through the world. And he's extremely faithful to them. I mean, he is absolutely devoted to doing the right scientific experiment. He would throw away 5 years' work if he found a single error in it that he couldn't actually understand and make sense of. So they're kind of, you know, I don't want to say they're gods for him, but they've given him structure and purpose and inspiration and joy. You know, I think he's having fun playing music. So music played a little more of a central part here because music's central to the character.
And it was also really cool to see the contrast in the way that he talks about his science, and it's like he understands it so well, and he's very knowledgeable in that area. But then when he talks about music and his heroes in the music field, he gets all giddy, and you can see that light in his eyes in both kind of topics that he mentions too.
Well, I think one of the things that, you know, we're all leaders and we're all followers in different contexts. You know, last night I went to Fenway Park, and my friend, the scientist Tyler Jacks, who's in the film and who founded the Koch Institute, which is 900 scientists and lab techs at MIT. I went, and he was going to throw out the first pitch at the baseball game. And when he's chairing a meeting with Obama and Biden on cancer, he's fine. When he's in a board meeting for Amgen, he's fine. When he's talking to MIT about 2,000 scientists, he's fine. When he's walking out to pitch a baseball, he's scared to death. And, you know, all of us have a little bit of that, right? I mean, and, you know, Jim, before he's going to go play with Willie Nelson, he can't sit still. He's shaking. He's so nervous, you know, and that's great. He's just pushing himself all the time.
And Bill, what about you? So what are your kind of like inspirational figures, whether it's within this creative filmmaking film or whether it's outside? What kind of makes you all giddy and stuff?
Well, you know, I think my sources of inspiration tend to be a little more specific. So it's not, I too would be shaking if I was playing harmonica with Willie Nelson or throwing out the first pitch at Fenway Park or dropping the puck at the Bruins game. So those are, I have the same sort of, you know, boyhood idols that, you know, you might expect from somebody of my generation. And I'm equally comfortable in social and scientific and, you know, political contexts. My motivation is really simple right now. I mean, I run these 2 drug companies, and I'm very interested. We're making 61 different drugs, and I'm very interested in seeing them have a consequence for patients. And that is, you know, this for my, you know, I started my first company as a college freshman a long time ago, and and my true north has remained using science and technology to make people's lives better. And that doesn't mean I've always been successful, because I haven't. But it's mean that that's kind of my central motive. And so my inspirations tend to be scientific entrepreneurs, you know, who, you know, if you thought all the way back, my favorite is Ben Franklin, because he had a sense of humor. He was a political, he reimagined politics. He had an extraordinarily generous view from people of very different backgrounds, particularly for the time. And then, you know, he was an inventor in lots of different ways, whether that was of the post office or the, or new printing methods. So, but it varies, you know, it varies. Sometimes I'm inspired by Brad Marchand's, you know, ability to move through 3 people at the same time and, you know, stay focused, even though somebody just broke his arm. So, you know.
So we have some questions in the chat right now, and actually in the Q&A chat. And I'll ask, how did you first learn about Jim Allison? Taking you way back, right? What made you decide to, I think I have a sense of what made you decide to make this movie, right? It's that unifying theme. And cancer, certainly, no, as you so aptly said, no one is pro-cancer. But how did you first learn about him? And you know,
well, I'd say, you know, Stéphanie, the other thing that, had Jim not been emotionally open, had he not been, you know, such a humane person, had I not thought that a 12-year-old girl could watch what he was doing and think it was cool, then I wouldn't have made the film. Because I don't honestly think that white papers and things that go, you know, expositionally are kind of worthy. I think they tend to play to the same folks who agree with them already. And so I think it was Jim's, both his accomplishments and courage and the slightly battered, consequence of some of those struggles, and his just genuine willingness to just be who he is. And a lot of, if in one of the earlier questions you asked me, or I think Douglas asked me about who we filmed, and the real answer is we filmed 3 times more people than are in the film. And many of them are incredibly formidable Nobel Prize winning scientists, but they're so protective on camera, they won't say anything.
Got it.
And so all of them I just threw out. And I thought, my friend Louis Lanier, who may or may not, but who you see in the film, was likewise willing to be, very real, very authentic, very in the moment, and emotional about what science means, what Jim means, what the journey has been. I think part of what inspired me for Jim, of course, Jim is a pioneer of something that is, I think, game-changing. I think immuno-oncology is at the absolute beginning still. And I think we could talk about that in a different context if you wish, but I think it's going to lots of fields well beyond cancer. I think it's triggered an entirely different perspective on the immune system, and that's, of course, central to human health. I think even Jim can't see the full future any more than Einstein could when, Niels Bohr is talking to him about quantum theory, and he's like, that his vision has gone so far, but no further for the moment. And so I think that it was partially that, but it was also partially that there was a central figure in it in the way that is less common with lots of science, where there's multiple people, even if you think of CRISPR, right, there was a lot of combative views about who, what, if you look at a really good film called Particle Fever, really interesting, it's kind of the system is doing cool science. And that's a great thing and very worthy. And I admire the filmmaker in the film, but it wasn't what I was thinking about. So in this case, Cell published an article saying, you rarely can find a scientific advance that's been so crystallized in the mind and behavior of a single person. And I think that in this case, we were very lucky that that person was so emotionally approachable.
Thank you. Thank you for that.
So I have another question from the audience, and this is from Rita. And she said, science communication is incredibly important for scientists to effectively influence decision-making of industry, regulators, and general audience. So Jim Allison seems to be incredibly successful at this. What do you think made him so unique? And the same question to you, what advice do you have for effective science communication?
Well, I don't want to disagree, and I know you're being recorded, and I love Jim Allison. But I will say, I think that he is, I think there are folks who are more successful as science communicators than Jim. And I tell you that not to say anything critical of Jim, but just to remind you that nobody's good at everything. And so, I went to Jim's Nobel lecture, and there were 500 people in the room in Stockholm, and Jim, talked above the head of 492 of them. I would say to Jim, imagine that we're filming this for a 12-year-old girl. And then he would talk to the level of a very sophisticated postgrad. And then I would say, think of a 4-year-old girl. And he would talk to somebody who had just finished their PhD, but hadn't started their postgrad. So as a human, he's incredibly warm and approachable, but the way he thinks scientifically is not always easily communicated for an audience beyond a narrow and scientifically educated and sophisticated audience. I would say, as an example, Tyler Jacks is far more skilled at toning his message to the audience. So Louis Lanier is far more skilled at tuning his message to the audience. These are folks who are naturally reading the room, understand who they're talking to, are clear about what they want to say, and are able to modulate the language, acronyms, character length, humor, circumstance to who they're talking to. And likewise, this is central to what you're doing, all of you are doing. In some context, there are scientists who believe that the reason that Homo sapiens prevailed at a time when Neanderthals and Homo sapiens were present at the same time, and Neanderthals were far stronger, is narrative, right? Human beings were able to use narrative to create bonds, whether those bonds are religions or ethnic groups or widespread family or ultimately nations. And understanding how to tell a story in a way that's compelling to the specific audience in front of you, is an art, but it's one that you can train for and think about. I remember taking I took classes, with a series of really gifted scientists. And in this case, I'm thinking about Stephen Jay Gould and E.O. Wilson, who are both evolutionary biologists of some renown. And if you read the essays of Stephen Jay Gould, the collected essays, you'll find a really beautiful example of an extraordinary scientist who's got really revolutionary thinking about things as fundamental as how evolution works, but is able to kind of put it in terms that are approachable to almost anybody, almost all the time. And so I think the first answer to the question, you'll forgive me, I don't remember whose question it was, but is to think about the audience. You often will see a film director or a playwright or a performer who says, this is what my story I want to tell. This is what I want to do. And you can hear the kind of egotism in that. Very rarely, but sometimes there are folks who are really thinking about building a bridge between themselves and the audience, who are really thinking about what the audience wants to hear. And, who are thinking not I, but we. And I think that that's a central piece to all communication. Who specifically are you talking to, and what particularly are you trying to communicate? Filmmaking is part of that. And we mentioned this earlier, it's not, I spent the morning doing investor presentations and recruiting stuff. We don't use films to do that because it doesn't allow the kind of dialogue. But if you're really trying to change people's minds for the long haul, then filmmaking is extremely powerful for doing that. And I think we've talked about it already. Part of that's about the music.
We have another question here in the chat, and it might go to the comment that you made earlier, Bill, with respect to all of the individuals that you interviewed for this film, right? That really contributed to the development of IPI. And the question, it's question/comment is, I love the movie. My only problem was that it didn't include more people that made a huge discovery possible. The movie didn't highlight women and underrepresented people in science. I am myself a scientific granddaughter of Jim Allison. We know that science takes a community. Do you have any comments to that?
Yeah, I both agree and respectfully disagree. I mean, it's true that you can only have so many central characters in a film like this, especially where, to the person with the question, they probably understand all the science, but for us, we're trying to communicate the science. So in a story like that, we essentially have 5 or 6 lead characters, and of them, 3 are women and 1's a woman of color. And it is true. So I think that if you look at the patient we chose, whose courage I think really animates the film, as a woman, there were other patients. The physician that we chose at Bristol Myers was 1 of 3, and the 2 men have written me nasty letters that I should have focused on them, but I chose to focus on Rachel precisely because I wanted to help overcome these issues. Pam Sharma, of course, does end up with Jim in that sense. It's a beautiful thing. She's one of 40. It was one of 40 people at 40 clinics that were running these trials. So we focused on Pam, not because she wasn't spectacular. She was spectacular, but she was one of a series of people who were spectacular. So I don't, it is true. This is a tale of a drug that's discovered, the early work is in the 80s. The science starts in the 90s. It's approved now a decade ago. It takes 17, 18 years. And science and this world was even more white male dominated than it is today. And hopefully it will be tomorrow. So I could have tried to find the inventor of immuno-oncology as somebody with a very different set of characteristics than Jim has, but that such a thing didn't exist. So it would have been a way to just not to tell the story. Whether we could have focused on more characters successfully, I don't know. I think that, it's hard to build a relationship as a viewer with, if there's 13 lead characters. So we have 6 in 90 minutes. I think I would encourage the person who made these comments to make their own film, and maybe they'll figure it out. I don't know how to do that better, but I would like to learn. So my experience is that films that have 15 characters, you tend not to know who the lead is. You tend to not know who to emotionally connect with. It tends to be less of an emotional journey, and you get a little more distanced from it. But Shakespeare figured it out. So obviously it can be done. I just don't know how to do it.
And so you also mentioned how important it is with filmmaking to kind of tell the story of these scientists and these heroes to those 12-year-old girls or or other people. So how do you see this kind of world of filmmaking and science coming together? Because even through your other films, like how was that kind of dynamic with the experts in coal mining or worker exploitation or the social work? How does that all tie in? And I guess, yeah, I'll ask the second question later, but.
Well, some of it is about intention, so, and it took a lot for me to persuade Jim Allison to let the science be, at the level the science is in the film. Now, he didn't have control, but he initially wanted to explain the full immune system in every way, shape, or form. And I was like, Jim, we can do that, but the people you want to do it to talk to already know it. And the, person who's trying to figure out whether they're going to take that second biology class in high school, won't be able to follow it. So, ultimately we found the path that we found together, and I'm grateful that Jim was willing to let me simplify the science so that it would be available to folks. Then some of its intention. So, here's an example. The film qualifies to be for an Oscar, which it did in this case. I had a previous film that was shortlisted for an Oscar. There's a whole process if you're shortlisted for an Oscar of how you communicate with the voters. It's expensive, and it's like a PR campaign. You organize screenings, they come to them, you pay a bunch of dinners, people come, all this sort of stuff. I decided that I wasn't going to do any of it, and that instead I was going to build a teaching curriculum for schools, write a book. And by the way, back to your previous questioner's views, I'd like to tell you about the book, because there we focused very heavily on folks of all kinds of ethnic backgrounds and personal backgrounds. Take the film, the book, and the teaching curriculum. We put it now, it's in almost 1,500 schools in the United States. We built it in, now we've translated it all into Spanish and Chinese and French and Italian and Russian, and it's going all over the world. So I think part of it is just, if you're trying to talk to the schools and the kids, you got to take the action that follows that intention. It can't just be, wouldn't it be great if, and I'm going to move on to my next thing. I want to tell you briefly the story, and look at this in my little office. I have a copy of it. Hold on if I can. But, you can have the books for free, so I'm not selling you anything. All the money goes to pay for the schools, so it's not like I give a rat's about any of that. This is the book that we made, okay, and I tell you the story because it's such an inspiring story for me. I was interested in these questions of ethnicity, gender diversity, but also the beautiful globalism that is behind working on cancer. And so I asked the folks who run the AACR annual meeting if I could come and set up a kind of photo system that's very similar to what, for those of you who are interested in photography, Richard Avedon used to set up for his portrait work. And I said, I'm going to come, I want to set it up in the middle of the hall. There are 40,000 cancer researchers to come. All I want to do is offer to photograph for free the first 300 people who come by. We're not going to induce them. We're not going to pay them. You're not going to choose based on anything, just whoever comes by. And we're going to ask them some questions about their background and permission to follow up with them. We'll give them the photographs and so forth. The first 300 people came from 80 countries. The first 300 people came from 80 countries. They came from little villages in Angola. They came from war-torn Syria. They came out of the Ukraine. They came from China. They came from Malibu. They came from Toronto and Vancouver. I mean, they came from everywhere, and they looked like humanity. And they together were joined in this beautiful common purpose in much the same way that I think of the team who you see featured in the film. And so, because I didn't know how to capture the stories and the, kind of dazzling diversity of science in a single film, we captured it in the book. And we tell the stories of many of those scientists from all over the world, from all kinds of different backgrounds and stories. And it just is the very paths that take people to become a scientist or a clinician. And it was a reminder to the United States, which was then in the midst of this kind of absurdist views about immigration and science, that they were, doing themselves damage. Not only is the right way for every country to greet another by holding out a handful of medicine or generous spirit in some way, but it's also not to welcome people who come with good intentions, as these cancer researchers do. And so, it's a story, the work that you're all involved in is the story of humanity. And what a spectacular story it is.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. We're almost at the top of the hour right now, and I just have one last question for you. If you'll indulge me, Bill. I had the pleasure. I was on another call yesterday. Had the pleasure of telling them, we're hosting the Filmmaker and for this great movie that was made. And one of the patient representatives in the call told me that she was one of the first Canadians that received IPI, and she had the opportunity to meet with Jim Allison, and what an incredible opportunity it was for her. And I just thought, just to, as we close, can you tell us a little bit about the patient that you featured in the film? And her story was so incredibly powerful, and bravery, as you said earlier, right, of all patients in making that decision to move forward in an early phase clinical trial. What can you tell us about her?
Well, I can tell you that she's doing great. So, she remains cancer. Her name is Sharon Belvin, as you may recall. Thank you. I'm glad to hear about the first Canadian recipient of IPI, and I know what it means to Jim, and I can imagine what it means to the patient to just be together, right? And Sharon Belvin, has a remarkable spirit. She got dealt the most challenging of all cards as a youngster. I mean, it's hard enough to deal with cancer when you're 60 or 70, but she was dealing with, she was 22. And she went through all the hellacious things. One of the things that can inspire all of us who work in immuno-oncology is the experience of people who get treatment for cancer that isn't immuno-oncology. And it doesn't mean that there aren't good-hearted clinicians who are doing, and it doesn't mean there aren't patients who benefit, but boy, it's a tough process. And you watch Sharon go through that, and it gives you all the more respect for her courage that she's now had repeated rounds of chemo and repeated rounds of radiation. Her cancer is metastasized to her brain. She's, essentially every bit of the ugliness you can reasonably go through, she's had. And she's still signing on for this. And Jed Wolchuk, who is her clinician at Memorial Sloan Kettering, and who's giving his cell phone in year 25 to his individual patients. I mean, how he finds the compassion and patience to deal with this day in and day out. But, there are really interesting studies on trials, and the trials where the clinicians give their cell phones to the patients do better than the trials where the clinicians don't, for all the obvious reasons, even though that doesn't show up in science one little bit. And so it is Jed's compassion too. And Jed, you see lightly when Pam says this about her bladder cancer cohorts, and Jed says it about what he's doing in melanoma. They're not just being compassionate with the patient, they're then going to the big drug company and saying, hey, pay attention to my opinion. I don't have any facts to prove this, but I will tell you these people are feeling better. And if you listen to that, it may be to our common, it may lead to our common success. So Sharon is thriving. I saw her, she came to the opening of the films. I've seen her, she came with us to Stockholm. She's a remarkable, dynamic woman, and I think inspiring people who are gripped by the understandable fear of having cancer. She's inspiring them individually, by day and by night, through the film, I hope in part, to keep going and that they have a chance. And so good for her and good for Jed.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Nice to be with you guys.
Yes. I'll turn it over to Megan for some last words.
So I think I'll start by saying thank you so much for participating in this, to the participants, and to you, Bill, for taking the time to answer our questions. I think it was really, really compelling and nice to have a bigger picture conception of quite a few of these topics as well. So just by way of updates to participants, we are going to be circulating a survey after, in the sense that once you close your Zoom screen, a survey will open. So we do ask you to fill that out to give us feedback. Secondly, as you would would have seen, this is recorded, and you'll be able to find the recorded video on BioCanRx at a later date in the next few days. And so, of course, we would be glad for you to disseminate that to anyone who wasn't able to make it today. And then with respect to other events that BioCanRx hosts, I think the best approach to learn about that is to either subscribe to our newsletter or to join us on social media at BioCanRx, or both. We'll be happy to have you at all of those. So with that being said, everyone, thank you again for your time, and very, very nice way to celebrate Cancer Immunotherapy Month. So thank you.
Thank you. And if folks, if you haven't had a chance, please take a look at this movie. It's exceptional. Thank you. And the link is available again till Friday.
Stéphanie, Douglas, Megan, thank you. What a pleasure being with you.
Thank you so much for joining us.
And good luck with the next
next
parts of your story.
We'll be on the lookout.
Yeah.
Luck is always valuable. Thank you for that.
Thanks.
Bye-bye, everyone. Bye now.
Bye.
Bye.